My companion, Michael Field, will be joining me at some point. We both just got off a call that ran a little late, so apologies, but we will be here soon. All right, let's see. Where is Michael? Okay, he's coming. He had technical difficulties, but he is on his way. Ah, there you are, Mike.
What's up, dude? Join. I couldn't get in here.
Well, I was just telling the audience that we both were on a call right before this that happened to go a little late. So apologies. I'm going to bend down and get my little pad for my standing desk. But all right. So, Mike, we're going to talk about a thing nobody's talking about, AI.
Very unique topic.
First to the topic. Specifically, we're going to talk about how to ensure, really, it's kind of a long-winded title, right? How to ensure AI projects are production ready. What are we really discussing here? I mean, I think, everyone is talking about AI, agents, MCP, et cetera, but I think a lot of organizations are still kind of stuck in just kicking the tires around mode. I actually just got off a call with a customer of ours here at Kong that was asking specifically about this, like where should we start on the agentic thing? We're starting to experiment with these things, trying to figure out our way around it. And I think we want to talk about on this live stream, I hope this is what you came to discuss, but I came to discuss how to kind of think about making that move from just experimenting, kicking tires around to, okay, we're actually shipping real AI value out into production, like into the real world. Does that sound aligned with what you were thinking, Mike?
Not what I had in mind, but I can roll with it.
What did you have in mind?
No, that was pretty much it.
All right, good. You scared me there for a second. So I think maybe to set some context, there are a lot of moving parts that I think organizations need to think through when they're thinking about, even AI. Like maybe we should break this up, right? Like AI, very broad topic, right? I think for this conversation, we'll probably be talking mostly about sort of three major AI entities, those being LLMs, agents, and yes, we'll talk about MCP as a component of the interaction between those two things. And of course, we talk about the API as well, because that's everywhere. So I think when we're thinking about those things and organizations are thinking about how can we be successful with those things, there are kind of three high-level components that I hear organizations speak about. And I think maybe we'll talk about one today. So the sort of like the data side, like what data are you feeding into your models, what data ends up being exposed to these various services, all this stuff happening on the backend side with the data itself. There's like the agent and application layers, the ultimate consumer. And then there's whatever sits in the middle, right? What I call sort of the infrastructure layer of all of this. And I think, it's our take here at Kong that while there's work to be done on all three of those categories, we are focused mostly on that infrastructure layer. And I think we've chosen to focus there to start simply because, I feel that if organizations are going to be successful solving the agent problems, it's going to be because they were successful solving the API infrastructure and API consumption problems. At the end of the day, I think just API consumption is everywhere here. It's going to be very different. There are different ways to think about that, right? The agentic world. But so I think we'll spend most of our time talking about that layer. Mike, unless you'd have anything that you think is worth us discussing as pertains to this topic.
Yeah, I think we'll mostly hang in that layer, but as we talk about some kind of general things like what actually is an agent, what's going on with MCP, we'll bring in some other pieces as well.
Cool. And so to talk about it, as Mike and I are wont to do, we're going to do a live Miro whiteboarding session. I'm actively creating the Miro board as we speak, and Mike, I will share it with you.
Thank you.
So this is the AI stuff Miro board. Yeah, 1 minute here. Let me share the link and then I'll share it on the screen. All right, Mike, this is going sent to you in Slack.
Cool.
You have access to it. So maybe, get that all up, Mike, and tell us what an agent is.
Tell you what an agent is. All right, let me log into Miro here, make sure I'm in your right board. AI stuff, nice.
Yeah, stuff. Yeah.
All right, well, not much to draw out here, but agent's a broad term. Everyone's going to define it a little bit differently. But I think the definition that's made the most sense to me is kind of breaking it into 4 components. So I think you have your chat bots, right? Everyone sees ChatGPT and that's just getting to a response. You're getting some kind of text response. Now, ChatGPT today is a little bit more than I think a standard chatbot. You know, it has different functionality. It does have tool calling now. It has memories of your past conversations. So ChatGPT is actually really starting to blur the line. But I think the 4 things you need inside to be considered a true agent are: 1, you need tools. So you need some ability to go beyond just what you were trained on as an LLM, some kind of tools you can act on and bring in additional data or complete additional actions. You need a memory of your past steps, because ultimately this is going to be an iterative cycle. You're going to be looping through with different agents or even just as a single agent. So with the memory, then you need a way to loop and reason iteratively. Now that's what an LLM already does by default. Every loop you can see has a new prompt coming in. It's going to reason about that prompt and any additional context or data that might be coming in from the tool calls. And then finally, you just need goals or tasks provided to that agent. So you could look at that as your initial prompt. So a very, very basic agent flow could be as simple as, a user comes to an LLM, asks for the weather, and provides it basically as part of the context, a bunch of different tools, including a weather API can call. The chatbot can see that come in. It can reason about it, saying, hey, I'm not trained on data like that. I need to pull in some additional context. And it can pass that tool call back to the client. Client can go get that additional data, provide that context back to the LLM yet again. Now it has the weather data that it needed, and it can go back and answer that prompt with the additional context that came in there. You could view that as a very simple form of an agent. So again, just having those 4 pieces: you need tools, you need memories of past steps, you need a way to reason and loop iteratively, and then you need some kind of goal or task for that agent to accomplish.
Nice. So what is going to be necessary to make all those things work well as it pertains to that infrastructure layer that we're going to talk about today? I think maybe that's what we can start to whiteboard out.
Okay. Well, I think a big piece of this is, this might be a little bit ahead of what we want to whiteboard right now, but you need some kind of standard for that tool calling. You have a lot of different ways to expose tools. You have a lot of different LLMs who might have been trained different ways to work with tool calls. And that at a high level is what MCP is, the Model Context Protocol. It's just, you can look at it as there's a bit more going on there, but you can think of it as a standard for tool calling, or a standard way to get context to an LLM, right? There's different types of context you can do beyond just tools. There's resources, there's prompts, there's sampling, but most people right now are just using it for tool calling.
Well, so when you say there's different kinds of contexts and tools and et cetera, like what kind of stuff to keep it a high level for people like myself, what kind of stuff is MCP, specifically the MCP server, going to need to have access to, right, to be able to provide the agent with what it needs to get its jobs done?
Yeah, maybe in the Miro board. Are you sharing your screen on the Miro board?
Yeah.
Can't see it.
All you.
Well, you can just share it so I don't switch back and forth.
Yeah, sounds good. Right. AI stuff Miro. I think the audience can see it. Can somebody confirm?
See a blank transparent.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
The screen sharing might not be working, because that's also what I see. All right, we might. Oh, I think it needs to be. Let's see. It looks like this needs to be brought onto the stage, but I am for some reason not able to do that. Let me see if any of the folks working in the background can make this happen. One moment while we parse through these technical difficulties.
Demo God's getting this early. We're not even demoing.
Yeah, we had this on the last call we were on. To the stage. All right, let me see on LinkedIn. We'll see if it looks like this is actually, it's not visible to me. So we'll see if it's visible to folks on LinkedIn. One moment.
Amanda said to try sharing again. Alex, I don't know if you want to.
Okay, yeah, I'll try that again. Yeah, it's not working on LinkedIn either. So let me try this now. Yes, there it is. Thank you. Thank you, folks in the background helping us. Okay, so Michael, you're going to draw some stuff out.
Yeah, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to see if I can just copy and paste an image in here. Yes, I can. Can you zoom in on that, Alex? Get that centered for folks. So this is kind of just a good, easy overview of kind of how MCP will behave. So it's about as simple as it can get. You have a user yourself. You're going to go to your MCP client of choice. This could be an IDE, something like Cursor, or again, we can just use the ChatGPT example. Everybody's probably used a chatbot at this point. So the way this works is you have the MCP client that's connected to one or more MCP servers. For our use case today, we're just going to pretend we have a single MCP server. And then, of course, we have our LLM here. And so when the client starts up, basically, it's going to fetch context from all the servers that it's connected to, and it's going to return that context in the form of tools. So if you never looked at a tool before, a tool is essentially going to be an API call. So different API calls you can make. So one of these in the example we're going to look at here is called get weather. And it's going to have additional context beyond what you might just see in an open API spec, right? Open API spec is going to define the endpoints, maybe status codes respected, example response bodies, things like that. What we can do inside when you actually build an MCP server, you can actually provide intent. So different use cases when you might need weather, basically additional information provided in plain text that the LLM can better understand these tools and when it might want to use them. So then you as a user might ask the LLM, okay, what's the weather like in San Francisco? That comes in alongside all the tool calling context and that additional intent information I just mentioned. And the LLM's smart enough to know that it says, hey, I can't actually answer that question. I don't have any kind of live weather data. So it's going to return this tool call back to the client saying, hey, I need additional information provided by this tool based on the description that you gave me. And the client's going to handle this loop of passing it over to the server, and it's going to forward this tool call. At this point, the MCP server will execute the tool call. And this is where it's very important to note. That tool call, at least in this case, is really nothing more than an API call. It's getting the current weather for the city based on the parameters that the LLM passed. We get that result back. We forward it back to the LLM. The LLM now has that additional context, and it can construct a final response, and the chatbot can display that to the user. So again, a very basic flow there. But the key thing is here is MCP is kind of standardizing this process for all LLMs and all MCP clients and making this much easier to use and build this. So you basically can build it once and use it with your MCP client of choice and your LLM of choice. So it's really about taking this universal approach to context. But what's ultimately going on here is the way the context is actually retrieved is the MCP server making an API call. So what does this mean? Well, as we get past this kind of experimentation stage, again, not just with the managing of the LLMs themselves, but with the managing of these MCP servers, we're going to run into a lot of similar challenges that we've seen in the API world. So when you run an MCP server today, you often run it locally, but things are definitely trending towards all these MCP servers becoming remote. So when you have remote MCP servers, you're going to have different challenges. You're going to have authorization challenges. There's going to be security risks. I got to make sure that the tools that are injecting stuff, I can actually trust them and they're safe. I need to make sure these servers are highly available. If these go down and I have a lot of clients depending on them, obviously that's going to be a big issue. I need discoverability. I need documentation. How do I know which MCP servers exist? And then one challenge that I think is a little bit more unique to the MCP world than just the API world is as these go remote and become more and more ubiquitous, once you start connecting to tens or hundreds or thousands of servers, the MCP client by default right now, it sends in all that context. So all the tools from all the upstream MCP servers you're connected to are sent as context to the LLM. And one, that's going to kind of degrade the quality of the response, but it's also expensive. You're burning a lot of tokens. All the context you're adding now is sent along with every single request from the MCP client, in this case, a chatbot. And if you have tens, hundreds, or thousands of tools, you're going to rack up costs, pretty significant costs quite quickly.
So, if we're thinking about agentic stuff, AI stuff, do we really only need to be thinking about MCP and LLMs? Are these the only two stakeholders that the organization needs to be thinking about protecting, exposing, observing, et cetera? Or is there other stuff that you think is still relevant? For example, we always hear at Conf, there's no AI without APIs, right? I don't see API on here. I know somewhere in there, right? But what else do these organizations, or what should they be thinking about, right, for setting up agents to be as successful as they possibly can be?
Yeah, and so that's the piece where the MCP server, yes, this might be something for all those challenges, security, high availability, that could also maybe use a proxy in front of it. But now let's say you build out 2 or 3 MCP servers and they're all leveraging the same API. So these MCP servers are acting like your traditional client application, right? So when you're typically working with an API, you're building an application, you're working with some type of API there. Mm-hmm. That API is usually protected with authorization, have things like rate limiting. You need to be able to discover those APIs. So whoever's building out these MCP servers are building out client applications that are still consuming APIs. So API consumption is not going away with MCP, it's increasing. We have a whole new type of client application being created now.
And as far as, I think this is where we probably get into the infrastructure component, right? We've mentioned a few times, like, where does it fit, right? So if you had to point to, you mentioned you put a proxy in front of these things, could be consuming APIs. There are a lot of organizations out there that are now thinking about the AI gateway as a product category, right? And I think it's good, like we should, right? Whether that's AI gateways that are sitting in front of the LLM, or AI gateways now being actually repurposed to govern MCP traffic, right? But I think there's a lot more that needs to happen outside of just the gateway side, right? A proxy is just a proxy. There's a lot more, I think, or a lot more functionality that needs to be layered on top of that in order to be successful. So maybe we should maybe map that out, I think, and I'll move into the mirror board, the way that we sort of think about it, right? If you look at, because we at Kong, and I don't want this to become a vendor pitch, but we've built out our platform sort of ready and purpose built for some of these AI and agentic use cases, right? So when we think about our structure of our platform, we think about it as sort of there's these two dimensions, right? So I'll draw out the first one. Well, if my arrow will work. Whoops.
Bigger arrow there.
What's that?
A bigger arrow there.
There we go. Does that work? All right. So there's our first arrow. And that first dimension, we sort of think about this as the vertical dimension, which refers to sort of full lifecycle support. So for folks that have, worked with us here at Kong for things like full lifecycle API management, this will be relatively familiar, right? And yes, there's lots of different stages to the lifecycle of something like an API. Depending on who you ask, it could be 10, 12, 15, however many. We like to kind of break them down into 4, right? So, because I think you really can compress all those stages into 4. And that first one is build. Second one is run. Third one is discover. And that fourth one, running out of room, is what we call govern, right? So if we think about what do I mean by all these things, if I were to just put a quick definition, build, there's everything from design, debug, test, and actually doing some real dev/build work or creating something, right?
Alex, you want to zoom in just a hair more?
Yeah, can you see that?
Nice, yeah.
Yeah. And then on the run, this is ensuring, this is your typical runtime infrastructure, right? Can you run these services? Really, can you expose these services securely, reliably, etc., for consumption? Discover, and I think this is going to be something that's really interesting as we think through what this looks like to solve for it in the agentic world as opposed to the human world. But how do we essentially enable self-serve access, right? Self-serve, I should say, discovery of and consumption of, I'll say whatever asset the consumer wants. And if you think about the, traditional consumers can be your dev, right, or your client application. I think going forward, there are new consumers, right? The agent, there are consumers. You could think of Cursor as a consumer, right? You'll still have your human and your application consumers that aren't agentic, but this agentic non-human consumer is something that is interesting to think about. So we'll discuss, we'll discuss a little bit around what that might look like. And then governance. And, when I think about governance, I think a lot of people think the word security here. Security is absolutely a part of it, but I think governance really is a consistency thing, right? Consistency, operationalization of best practices, right? And that could be best practices, of course, around security, but also reliability, also observability and visibility, right? The point is, typically when you're thinking about API governance or governance in an organization, you have like an API governance board or a governance team that says these are the best practices, these are the standards that we want our organization to follow. And a proper governance practice is going to somehow be able to keep visibility into how these best practices are being adhered to, and then ultimately enforce them in some manner. There's different carrots and sticks, top downs, bottoms ups approaches to that. But it's interesting. So we've done all this on the API side, right? You think about this vertical support and where did we start implementing that here at Kong? Yes, and now we get into this horizontal layer. So this horizontal layer refers to these other services. So I will zoom out. I know it gets a little small, but your traditional API stuff. We just released and launched our eventing stuff. So like for event streams, of course, you have your microservices use case, things like mesh and ingress control, et cetera. But now also, and I'll put this up here to make more room for it, this is where AI comes in, right? So where we're focused right now is LLMs and MCP servers, right? And it's our feeling that I think a lot of organizations now, as they're thinking about how to approach these AI use cases, make them prod ready, they're really focused here,
Yep.
right? And so they're focused on something like an AI gateway, right, for traffic control. And that's good. Like, we're not saying you shouldn't do that. We think the gateway is the core of a proper platform practice around this. But Mike, I'm curious, like, what along these other 4 buckets, what do you think organizations need to be thinking about, right, when they're thinking about build, discover, and govern phases of this kind of for this kind of connectivity?
Yeah, so I mean, starting from exactly what you just said, right? Like, everybody's focused on the run stage right now. A lot of people are worried about, issues with prompt security. Obviously they want to control token consumption. Everybody's thinking about this run stage, or what we're defining as the run stage here, but really just around traffic control. But again, that's great when you're kicking the tires and you're starting to think about, okay, operationalizing, interactions with the LMs and what that looks like. But if we look at what happened with APIs, you have the sprawl developing, right? So we introduced a dev portal, so it's easier to discover, maintain, and centralize documentation. We're going to have the same thing on the AI side. When it comes to governance, like, again, everything's fine at the initial stage when you're kicking the tires. Maybe you're running a POC. Nobody really minds ClickOps. It's honestly an easier way to learn. But you don't want to use ClickOps when it comes to your production deployments with these things. One manual misconfiguration brings down the whole system, right? It's much more difficult to audit. You're going to want to move into some kind of automation workflow. And so, again, not to focus just on Kong, but that's why we build out such robust automation tooling. Yeah. That's our Dex CLI, our Terraform provider, our Kubernetes operator. You need to have some kind of automation tooling that works for the runtime environment that your organization is committed to. And so I think those are the big ones, but there's a lot of pieces that come along with the overall platform. It's not just the portal side and the register, or you have it on there, the internal registry. Make sure things are adhering to best practices. So as you start to build those out, it's interesting. It's kind of just got tied to the govern piece as well. Is as you kind of set up these guardrails, you need to be able to have visibility into when basically a piece of your infrastructure aren't adhering to those. So something like in an internal developer platform where you have scorecards that can kind of rate all the stuff that you have committed to your registry and highlight things that need to be updated or changed or are out of the spec as you define them.
Yeah, and one other thing, I want to get into this idea of the portal and the registry, because there's a lot of really interesting things to discuss around, like, what's the difference and how will a portal experience, a self-service discovery experience for the agent differ from the human dev, right? I think it's worth discussing, but there is one other layer here in the build, and it is a little, you are typically using something like the gateway to do this, but I think especially, when you're thinking about enabling access to things like LLMs for agents, I think more and more organizations are going to adopt a multi-model architecture, right? So, like, I probably would add here in the build, once again, very much linked to the AI gateway functionality, but the ability to build, and then of course via the gateway expose, multi-model universal APIs. Because I think what organizations are finding is something similar to what they saw in these backend API sprawl, right? Not having some sort of unified interface to interact with all these backend services. The same thing is going to exist on the LLM side, right? Where organizations want to, slightly different, but a similar thing, I should say. You're going to want to bring in multiple models, whether it's for the specialization benefits, cost, performance benefits. It's similar to multi-cloud, right? There's instances where some cloud vendor makes sense maybe here, and another one here, another one here. Same thing on the model side, right? So as organizations bring in all these multiple models, giving agents or other consumers or clients, maybe it's the agent directly, maybe it still is a human dev, maybe it's the MCP client or something, giving access to multiple models through a unified API interface, I think is really important, right? So thinking about your exposure to these multi-model architectures as universal API products, I think is pretty important, which brings us into this question, right? Because if you build that multi-model universal API product, but multi-model universal API product, now you need to think about publishing that for self-service access. I mean, I know we don't know all the answers to this question yet, Michael, but I'd just be curious to get your take. How is that experience going to need to differ between human as API consumer, as an agent as API consumer, and something like a self-service portal? Do you have any opinions on that?
Yeah, I mean, some early thoughts, right? I mean, again, obviously you start talking about agents, maybe the UI aspect loses some of its luster and the need and the focus there that we often see with human developers. But you're still going to need like robust documentation, right? Like all these things, if you get to the point where, we've gotten with APIs where a lot of organizations are struggling to keep their API specs up to date or even had them at all. And you just have the sprawl of now APIs that are lacking documentation with, say, MCP servers or whatever the protocol choice ends up being there that are also lacking documentation consuming those APIs. You can just see, this nesting issue we're going to have and the complexity that's going to arise if we don't start building kind of these robust registries out.
Yeah, it's interesting. I heard someone talking about, thinking about the OS specification, because that's always one of my questions. It's like, well, why not? Why would that not work? These things are meant to be like machine readable or whatever. And I'm just thinking through this question of like how well specified do these things need to be? And one person was like, well, we think that the agents are going to be much better, like at being able to parse through messy documentation, or even maybe the move is to present this stuff in more natural language format, right? It's all very interesting stuff. I don't know what the answer is there yet.
Yeah.
The point is there will need to be probably some standard that is adopted to make this relatively consistent. Or else, yeah, like you said, I think we'll end up in the same place we have with APIs, where people are still struggling to standardize how they specify and document these assets.
Yeah, and just to hone in on that point, because I think that's a point of confusion for a lot of folks. I know it was for me when I first started looking at MCP, is we developed this whole open API spec, and the idea is it's machine readable, so tooling can use it, and it's also human readable. You can understand the spec and understand what the different endpoints look like. But for LLMs that, again, they're designed around natural language, you might be able to understand the basics of, okay, here's what this endpoint does. But especially when you start working with more complex API specs, you can go test this out with an LLM. You can feed it a spec and get commands to run through, maybe even use it to help you design like an application that's using those API endpoints. And it really kind of starts to struggle when you start looking at real workflows, because ultimately, doing something very basic, something that might take 5 to 10 clicks in the UI, there could be a lot of API calls that are actually going on underneath the hood. And so actually understanding how different endpoints need to be chained together, you have to pass parameters. So, an example of Kong, if I want to make a modification to a control plane, first I have to get the ID of the control plane, and it might be CP_ID in one API. And then in another API where I want to leverage that parameter could have a slightly different name. And these are all things that really trip up models, versus when you have something like the MCP layer on top where you can communicate intent. You can say, okay, here's the endpoints that you're going to need to call, describe each of those endpoints in natural language. The models are much, much more successful at actually chaining together these workflows. Mm-hmm. And so that's a big piece of where that comes from. It's, again, really trying to, these tool calls, like the basic example I gave with the get weather, it's probably not what you're going to see for tooling. Tooling is usually multiple API calls packaged together, maybe from different APIs instead of just one. And so that's where the value comes in. That you have this bundled tool concept, which underneath is a bunch of different API calls, but the LLM can actually understand that.
Yeah, and I know where I'm looking at the clock now, we're right at time, but I know we started a minute or two late, and we had some tech difficulties as well. So I'm going to fit in one more question for you. We've talked about these, LLMs, MCP stuff. We've talked about API calls being made, and we're still working with a lot of organizations here. I speak to companies all the time. They're still thinking about this stuff, right? How do we bring something like event streams into our API platform? How do we manage and govern east-west communication, for microservices deployment, service-to-service stuff? I mean, where do these things fit in, right, into the larger equation, if anything, right? Because I do hear, especially from the event broker vendors out there, and I was at an event recently listening to folks talking about how things like real-time data are also just going to be yet another service that needs to be available, right, to the agent to help get their job done. So how do you see these two, and I think really specifically around the event streaming stuff, how do you see that playing into this larger sort of platform around your AI projects equation?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, this is going to become another, if you take something like Kafka as like a system of record, this is another resource for consumption for your LLMs, right? I mentioned earlier, context isn't just limited to tools. One of these could be the idea of resources. So think about going and grabbing any kind of documentation, maybe that's specific to your business. So if you had say you're working with an agent internally at your organization, hey, can you draft a follow-up email to Acme Corp that, references this last call and ties in the pricing slide for my proposal deck?
Yeah.
On its own, no LLM in the world can answer that question. It needs access to context. And again, maybe it doesn't need just tool calls there, but it needs access to some of those resources I mentioned. And so eventing is often a system of record and has very, pertinent business information in there that the LLMs are also going to want access to.
Yeah, it's interesting. we've talked about this vertical layer, and maybe if we can end here, right? I think that the ultimate recommendation is, yeah, we need to be thinking about this full life cycle support. We need to be thinking about universal LM products, running, exposing them securely, making them discoverable via agents, making it governable through automation, guardrail scorecards. But I think maybe, I mentioned there's two dimensions, right? To what we're thinking through is what a modern API platform should look like. Is this horizontal dimension, right? Which really refers to the various kinds of APIs and services that are supported. So I think if we draw that out, horizontal, which are APIs and services supported, we can just make this AI, right? Stands for LLMs, MCP, whatever. I mean, I think really the answer is maybe you do start here, right, by tackling that vertical sort of AI full lifecycle use case. But it seems to me like eventually you're going to still have to think about your traditional APIs. You're going to think about your events, and still think about your microservices. That really this entire sort of diagonal layout of the platform, right? Full lifecycle support across all these APIs and services are going to be necessary for agentic success, right? It can't just be this. Maybe start here with packaging up LLMs and controlling governing traffic from MCP servers. But like, once again, all these are still going to be resources. So all that effort as an organization that you've put into to building these kinds of connectivity patterns doesn't have to go to waste. If once again we make this easily consumable, some sort of unified manner for the agent.
No, 100%. Yeah. Ultimately, those are just different patterns and ways for moving data around, and agents live off of data. Agents want to consume more data. And so again, we're not moving away from any of these. Again, we're not moving away from APIs. APIs are going to be more in demand than ever. And these problems that we've seen and learned over, API management best practices over the past 10, 15 years are kind of about to explode with the world of AI taking off like it is.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think I could not agree more. I couldn't say it better myself. And once again, we were 5 minutes over time. So if you have any questions, just put them in the comments. We'll address these afterwards. We'll keep track of everything via LinkedIn and YouTube across the next several days, because it will continue to run live in your feed. But thanks for taking the time to hang out with Mike and I. Apologies for the tech difficulties and us showing up a minute or two late. Work calls sometimes. But we will hopefully be on in the next several weeks. I've got some time off coming up, but after that, Mike and I still owe you all an event streaming specific new LinkedIn series. So we will be back. I don't know if it'll be live streamed, but we'll at least be getting back to our everyday programming around the API platform videos that we were pushing several weeks or so, a month or so ago. So you all will see us again soon. Once again, any questions that you all have, put them in the comments and we'll address them. Thanks so much for the time, and I look forward to being back on our next